Listen closely. Do you hear that? That sharp, violent crack of ice against marble. That sound is not just ice shattering. That sound is the sound of a man signing the death warrant of his own empire, and he doesn't even know it yet. Close your eyes for just a moment and imagine the room. 500 of the wealthiest, most powerful people on the African continent gathered under the glittering chandeliers of the most prestigious ballroom in Abuja. Crystal glasses, couture gowns, the low hum of ambition and old money buzzing through the air like electricity. This is not a room where ordinary things happen. This is a room where fortunes are sealed, where handshakes are worth more than most people make in a lifetime, where reputations are built or destroyed in the space of a single whispered sentence. And in this room, on this particular evening, a man decided to destroy his wife. His name was Kwame Asante, and until approximately 4 minutes ago, he was considered one of the most brilliant logistics entrepreneurs the continent had ever produced. 41 years old, sharp-jawed, the kind of man whose tailored suits seemed almost desperate to contain the ego beneath them. He had been invited to this gala as the guest of honor, the man of the hour, the continental innovator of the year. He had champagne in his hand. He had his mistress on his arm. He had his mother in the front row, clapping like a woman watching her favorite son ascend to godhood. And then he had the audacity, the breathtaking cruelty to grab the nearest chilling bucket from a passing waiter's tray and upend every drop of it directly over his wife's head. In front of 500 people, in front of cameras, in front of the one man whose opinion of him was worth more than every other pair of eyes in that room combined. The music stopped. The laughter died. The room held its collective breath like it was watching something sacred being desecrated in real time, because that is exactly what it was. And the woman at the center of it all, soaked, silk gown ruined, ice in her hair, freezing water running in rivers down her spine, did not run, did not cry, did not collapse. She opened her eyes. And at that exact moment, the most powerful investor in the room stepped to the edge of the stage and stopped breathing. Stay with me, because what happened next didn't just change Zola Asante's life, it changed the entire landscape of who gets credit, who gets power, and who gets to stand at the top of the empire they actually built. To understand what happened in that ballroom, you need to understand who Zola Mensa Asante was before anyone put a designer gown on her back. She was born in Kumasi, the third of 5 children, to a bus driver and a seamstress. Not a single day of her childhood was financially comfortable, but there was something in that house that money could not manufacture. Her mother's precise, methodical mind and her father's absolute refusal to accept that the systems were fixed. Her father used to say every single evening over dinner, "The system is not a wall. The system is a puzzle, and puzzles are meant to be solved." Zola solved puzzles for sport. By 16, she was already writing basic scripts to help her mother organize fabric inventory and track orders from the local market women who bought in bulk. By 19, she had earned a full scholarship to study computer science and systems engineering at the University of Ghana. She did not have the luxury of being average. Scholarships do not renew themselves for average students. She graduated top of her class. Not second, not honorably, top. Her final thesis, a supply chain optimization model designed specifically for the peculiarities of West African infrastructure, accounting for inconsistent road conditions, seasonal flooding, the informal economy, and cross-border customs delays, was quietly remarkable. Her professor submitted it to 2 academic journals. Both accepted it. She was 22 years old, and she had written something that most logistics PhDs would have struggled to produce. She took a junior role at a mid-sized freight company in Accra. She worked 12-hour days. She was grateful, and she was relentless. And that is where she met Kwame. He was 6 years older, charismatic in the way that certain men are charismatic, not through warmth, but through intensity, through the specific gravity of a person who is utterly convinced of their own importance. He came from a slightly better background. His father had owned a transport company that had since collapsed under mismanagement. Kwame had dreams, loud and specific. He wanted to rebuild. He wanted to be bigger than his father ever was. He wanted respect. He saw Zola working late one evening, 4 monitors open, headphones in, building something he could not quite understand. He sat down beside her and asked her to explain it. She did. He listened, and something inside him recognized immediately that what she was describing was not just clever, it was the blueprint for the exact company he had been imagining. A modern, technology-first logistics operation built for the realities of the African continent. Not a copy of a Western model, something new. He was smart enough to see it. He was not, as it would turn out, wise enough to honor it. They fell in love, or rather, Zola fell in love, fully and sincerely, the way brilliant, slightly isolated people often fall, hard, completely, with the specific kind of vulnerability that comes from never having truly been chosen before. Kwame fell into a partnership, one that looked like love from the outside, one that felt like love in his better moments. But at its core, Kwame Asante was always building something, and Zola was always part of the architecture. They married within 2 years of meeting. She was 24, he was 30. His mother, Mrs. Adwo Asante, attended the wedding in a rigid, carved silence that said everything about her feelings. She grew up watching women in her family make brilliant men possible. She understood that Kwame needed Zola's brain. She simply never believed Zola deserved credit for it. The company they built together was called Asante Logistics Solutions. Notice whose name was on the door. For the first 3 years, Kwame and Zola worked as a genuine unit. He was the face, she was the engine. This was not some quiet tragedy they both chose to ignore. In those early years, Kwame would tell anyone who listened that his wife was the actual genius of the operation. There are photographs from those first 12 months of a man who seemed genuinely proud to be building something alongside someone he admired. But money changes the geometry of relationships, and the specific kind of money that arrives suddenly, investor money, the kind that arrives with banquets and feature stories and invitations to rooms you were never supposed to be in, changes it fastest of all. Zola spent those years doing what she had always done, building. The core innovation of Asante Logistics Solutions was a proprietary algorithm, her algorithm, that the company called the Nexus Routing System. It did something that no other logistics software on the continent had managed to do with such precision. It predicted supply chain disruptions before they happened, not after, not during, before. It read weather patterns, road condition databases, port congestion data, customs processing rates, and a dozen other variables that Western logistics software didn't even know to account for. And it rerouted shipments automatically, in real time, adjusting delivery windows and carrier assignments with a fluency that felt almost biological. She wrote the original version on second-hand servers in a warehouse with a leaking roof. She debugged it at 2 a.m. She updated it while nursing their son through a fever. She iterated and improved it obsessively, the way only a person who is building from genuine love, love of the problem, love of the craft, love of what could become possible, is capable of doing. Nexus was not just good software. Nexus was a revolution in an industry that had been waiting decades for someone who understood its specific geography. Within 4 years of launching, Asante Logistics Solutions had contracts with 14 government ministries across 5 countries. They had partnerships with 3 of the largest agricultural export companies on the continent. They had been featured in Forbes Africa, in The Economist, in every technology and business publication that covered the African economy. The headline, every time, was Kwame Asante, the man reinventing African logistics. Not Zola, not the architect, not the woman who had written the system those headlines were built on. Kwame, in those early days, would sometimes correct journalists, would sometimes say, "My wife is the technical genius behind this." But as the invitations got grander and the rooms got more prestigious, those corrections grew smaller and less frequent, and eventually they stopped altogether. The money arrived. The status arrived, and with status came the specific corruption that certain men were never equipped to survive, the belief that they deserved to be where they were, not that they had been lucky or built on someone else's foundation or elevated by a partnership they were slowly dismantling, but that they deserved it, that they had earned it alone. Kwame moved his family into a 10-bedroom home in Maitama. He bought the cars, he bought the watches, he joined the clubs, and somewhere in the process of becoming the man he had always imagined, he stopped seeing Zola as a partner and started seeing her as an inconvenience. She was too quiet for his new friends, too technical, not glamorous enough. She had no interest in the socialite circuit, in the charity galas, in the curated Instagram life he was carefully constructing. She was still, at her core, the girl from Kumasi with 4 monitors and a problem to solve, and that girl had no place in the persona Kwame was building. He started staying out later, coming home less. When he did come home, there was a distance in his eyes that Zola had never seen before. Not the distance of distraction, but the distance of a man who has already made a decision and is simply waiting for the courage to enforce it. She did not beg. She was not built for begging. She went back to work. She always went back to work. And she waited. Because somewhere inside herself, even as the marriage darkened, even as the coldness calcified, she still believed that the man she had married was in there somewhere, that the partnership they had built could be rebuilt, that people who built empires together did not simply discard each other. She was wrong about that. Her name was Tiffany Osi. She was 27, a socialite, a brand ambassador for 3 different luxury companies, and the specific kind of beauty that photographs well and requires constant maintenance. She had never slept on a warehouse floor. She had never debugged code at 3 a.m. She had never built anything. But she laughed at every one of Kwame's jokes. She wore the right dresses to the right parties. She understood intuitively, instinctively, that her role was to reflect Kwame's image back at him in the most flattering light possible. And for a man who had spent 6 years being seen too clearly by a woman who knew exactly what he was, that kind of deliberate reflection was intoxicating. She found out the way most women find out, not through a dramatic revelation, but through the slow accumulation of small, impossible-to-ignore details, a perfume on a collar, a name appearing too often in too many contexts, the specific way a man looks at his phone when he thinks no one is watching. She knew. She had known for months before she allowed herself to fully know.
She said nothing at first. This was not weakness. This was the strategy of a woman who understood that if she moved too soon, without all the facts, without a plan, she would lose everything she had built. The house, the shares, the access to the system she had created and that was still running, still routing, still quietly generating the millions that funded Kwame's lifestyle. She consulted a lawyer in secret. She began quietly documenting. She was not a woman who moved without thinking. But Mrs. Adwa Asante had decided that this moment, the mistress, the distance, the slow collapse of the marriage, was the opportunity she had been waiting for since the wedding day. Let me tell you something about mothers like Adwa Asante. They are not rare. They are women who love their sons so completely, so without condition, that the love has curdled into something else entirely, something that looks like loyalty but functions like poison. Adwa had watched Kwame build something extraordinary, and rather than seeing a daughter-in-law who had made that possible, she saw a woman who was taking credit for her son's destiny. She had been whispering in Kwame's ear for years, subtle at first, harmless seeming, comments about how Zola didn't entertain well enough, how she dressed too simply, how her new associates made her uncomfortable with her quiet intensity, how a man of Kwame's stature needed a wife who could match his new world, and later, less subtly, how Tiffany understood him in ways Zola never had, how some marriages were simply not built to survive success. She told him Zola was holding him back. She told him Zola didn't love him, not really, that she had only ever loved the company they built together. She may or may not have believed these things. It doesn't matter. She said them, repeatedly, into the ear of a man whose ego was already cracking under the weight of a secret he had been carrying for months, that the genius everyone praised him for was not entirely his. Maybe that was the real rot at the center of it all, not the money, not the status, not even Tiffany, but the knowledge, the quiet, unrelenting, impossible to silence knowledge that Zola had built the thing he was being celebrated for, and that somewhere, someday, someone might figure that out. A guilty man always turns on the person who could expose him first. He started bringing Tiffany to events, not hiding it, displaying it. He made sure photographs were taken. He made sure the right people saw. He was not just having an affair. He was making a statement. He was performing a conclusion. He was telling anyone who paid attention that Zola Asante was no longer relevant to the story of Kwame Asante. And then he invited her to the gala, his crowning night, the night of his award. He could have simply not included her, could have left her home with their son while he celebrated with the world. But that would have been mercy, and mercy was no longer in his vocabulary. He brought her because he wanted an audience for what came next. The invitation was a trap, and Zola, who was brilliant about almost everything, walked right into it. Because even now, even after everything, she could not quite believe that the man she had built an empire with was capable of what he was about to do.
She wore gold because it was her mother's favorite color. That detail matters. In the middle of a night designed to humiliate her, Zola Asante wore the color her mother loved. She applied her own makeup, carefully, the way she did everything, methodically, without waste. She looked magnificent. Not the manufactured magnificence of Tiffany Osei's Crimson Couture, but something deeper, something structural, the kind of beauty that doesn't require a room's attention to sustain itself. She walked into the Transcorp Hilton Abuja alone. Her husband was already inside, holding court in the center of the room with Tiffany on his arm. She saw them from the entrance. She noted it. She straightened her spine, lifted her chin, and walked to a table near a grand pillar on the far side of the room, where she ordered mineral water and began quietly observing. She had learned in 6 years of marriage to a man like Kwame how to make herself invisible while remaining entirely present. It was a survival skill she had developed slowly, painfully, the way you develop a callus, not by choice, but by repeated exposure to pressure. The room was extraordinary. Even now, even knowing why she was there and what it would likely cost her, she could not help but notice the specific electricity of a room full of people who had all individually clawed their way to a kind of power that most people only read about. There was something almost beautiful about it, in the way that storms are almost beautiful. All that energy, all that hunger, all that carefully disguised desperation dressed in Dolce and Savile. Idris Mensa was on stage. She recognized him immediately, not from the room, but from her memory, from a name she had seen attached to a wire transfer 5 years ago, from a document she had found in Kwame's office once that he had not known she had seen, from the research she had done quietly, privately, on the company's investment structure. Idris Mensa was the reason Asante Logistics Solutions had the capital it needed to scale. He was the silent partner, the invisible engine behind the visible engine, a Ghanaian billionaire who had made his first fortune in telecommunications infrastructure and his second in strategic investment across the continent. He was reclusive in the way that truly powerful people often are, present enough to maintain authority, absent enough to maintain mystery. He did not give interviews, he did not attend events unless the event mattered to him personally. He was on stage tonight because the event mattered to him personally. Zola watched him speak. He was describing the future of African logistics, the potential of technology-forward supply chains, the importance of investing in indigenous innovation. His voice was deep and unhurried. He did not perform certainty the way Kwame did. He simply had it. She was still watching him when she noticed it. The presentation screens behind the stage, massive floor-to-ceiling LED panels cycling through graphics and data visualizations from Asante Logistics Solutions, had begun to malfunction. Not visibly to most people in the room, not in an obvious, embarrassing way, but Zola's eyes had been trained for nearly a decade to see errors in systems the way a musician hears a wrong note. And what she saw on those screens made her stomach drop. It was a version of Nexus, her system, running live, and it had a fatal flaw. Let me explain what she saw, because it matters. Not in technical terms, this is not a coding tutorial, but in human terms, in terms that explain why what she saw was not just a software bug, it was a time bomb. The Nexus system, as Zola had designed it, had 3 core redundancy layers. If the primary routing algorithm encountered an input it couldn't parse, an unusual combination of variables, a data point from a sensor it hadn't been calibrated for, it was supposed to fall back to layer 2 and then to layer 3 before defaulting to a manual override prompt. This redundancy was the system's most important safety feature. Without it, a corrupted input would not just cause an error, it would cascade, like a single crack in a dam. What was running on those screens was a version of Nexus that had been modified by someone, and Zola could tell from the visual signature of the data outputs that it had been modified by someone who understood the system well enough to change it, but not well enough to understand why it was built the way it was. Someone had removed layer 2, probably to make the system faster, probably because the redundancy looked from the outside like unnecessary overhead. The result was a system running live across 5 countries, managing the logistics of hundreds of millions of dollars in active shipments with a single-point failure vulnerability that anyone with the right or wrong data input could trigger. If that vulnerability was discovered, or if the wrong shipment variables hit the system in the next 48 hours, the cascade could lock up every active contract simultaneously. The financial exposure alone would run into tens of millions. The reputational exposure for a company whose primary product was reliability would be unsurvivable. She had to tell Kwame. This was the choice that defined who Zola Asante was. Not the ice, not the humiliation that was coming, but this, the fact that even now, even knowing what Kwame was doing to her, even having spent months quietly preparing for the end of this marriage, she still put on her gold gown and walked across that room to save him from a disaster he didn't even know was coming. Because that is what Zola did. She solved problems. It was not sentiment, it was not weakness, it was simply the most fundamental expression of who she was. A person who saw a catastrophic flaw in a system and could not walk away from it, regardless of the personal cost. She found Kwame near the bar. Tiffany was beside him, laughing at something he had just said. His mother was seated at a table 3 feet away, watching the room with the hawkish satisfaction of a woman who believes the evening is going exactly as planned. Zola leaned in. She kept her voice quiet. She kept her face neutral. She did not touch him. She said, "Kwame, the Nexus display on stage has a Layer 2 anomaly in the cascade sequence. Whoever modified the failsafe architecture created a single-point vulnerability. It's live across all active contracts. If a corrupted input hits the routing engine in the next 48 hours, the entire system freezes. You need to call your technical team right now before the presentation continues." She took half a step back. Her part was done. What Kwame heard was not a warning. What Kwame heard, in front of his mistress and the assembled audience of his carefully constructed new world, was his wife reminding him, publicly, unmistakably, that she understood a system he did not, that she possessed knowledge he needed, that without her, he was exposed. He heard her brilliance as an attack. He heard her protection as humiliation. His face went through 3 expressions in less than 2 seconds: confusion, recognition, and then a cold, white rage. His mother, watching from 3 feet away, saw the shift in his expression and read it perfectly. She straightened. She leaned forward slightly. She was ready. Kwame turned away from Zola. He signaled to a passing waiter. He lifted the champagne bucket from the tray in one smooth motion. He turned back, and then he poured it over her head.
There is a particular kind of silence that a room makes when it witnesses something it cannot categorize. Not horror, though there was horror in it. Not shock, though there was shock too. Something deeper, more primitive. The silence of 500 human beings simultaneously confronting the specific dissonance of watching a man commit an act of profound cruelty in a place of celebration and not knowing what to do with that information. The orchestra stopped mid-note. The catering staff froze. The cameras, there were cameras everywhere in that room, swung toward the sound. Tiffany Osei threw her head back and laughed, a bright, performative, theatrical laugh, the kind of laugh that is not really about amusement, but about allegiance, about choosing a side publicly and loudly before the dust has even settled. Mrs. Adwa Asante clapped her hands together, once, twice. The sound was like a gavel, like a verdict being delivered. Kwame Asante smiled. It was not a happy smile. It was the smile of a man who has done something he knew was irreversible and has committed to it entirely. He was waiting. He was waiting for her to crumble, for the tears, for the running, for the broken woman, the destroyed dignity, the public confirmation that she was nothing without him. He had spent so long telling himself that Zola was fragile underneath the competence, that her strength was performance, that somewhere inside her was a woman who could be broken if the pressure was exactly right. He was 30 years old when he met her. He was 41 when he stood in that ballroom, and in 17 years he had never once understood what he was dealing with. Zola Mensa Asante stood in the center of 500 horrified witnesses, soaked from crown to heel, her silk gown destroyed, ice melting in her hair, freezing water running down the back of her neck, and she was completely, utterly, magnificently still.
She closed her eyes. This is the moment I want you to hold on to, because in those 3 seconds of closed eyes, Zola was not falling apart. She was not summoning courage. She was not suppressing tears. She was doing what she had always done in moments of crisis. She was assessing. She was reading the room. She was calculating. She opened her eyes. And what she saw, looking up at the stage, was a man she had never met in person, standing at the edge of the podium, his crystal glass in pieces at his feet, staring at her with an expression she could not immediately name. It was not pity. It was not horror. It was something more complicated, something that looked almost like recognition. Idris Mensa descended the velvet stairs. He moved through the crowd the way water moves through a crack, not loudly, not dramatically, but with an inevitability that made everyone step aside. He was not large physically. He was perhaps 5'10", lean, his hair silver at the temples, his midnight blue tuxedo cut in a way that was understated to the point of understatement being a form of power. He moved like a man who had not needed to announce himself in decades because his presence did the announcing. Kwame, standing 10 feet from Zola, saw his investor descending the stairs and immediately recalibrated. He straightened. He prepared a smile. He extended his hand. This was still recoverable, his body language said. This could still be laughed off. Boys will be boys. Marital spats. Nothing to derail the evening. Idris Mensa walked past Kwame's outstretched hand without looking at it. He crossed the 10 feet to where Zola stood. He removed his tuxedo jacket, slowly, carefully, with the deliberate gravity of a man performing a gesture he has thought about for longer than this moment. He placed it over Zola's freezing shoulders. He adjusted it so it sat correctly. He stepped back 1 pace, looked at her face, and then, only then, turned to face the room. 5 years before that evening, Idris Mensa had received an anonymous document. He received dozens of anonymous proposals every month. People who knew his reputation as a continental investor sent pitches, plans, ideas, requests through every channel they could find. Most of them were not worth opening. His team had filters, screeners, systems for sorting the noise from the signal. But this particular document had passed through every filter, not because it had come through an official channel. It had not. It had arrived as an encrypted file attached to an email from an address that had never been used before and has not been used since. His cybersecurity team flagged it. His chief of staff recommended deleting it. He opened it anyway. He would tell this story later and say that he knew from the first 3 pages that he was reading something extraordinary. But that undersells it. What he was reading was not just an extraordinary business plan, it was an extraordinary mind. The document was a full supply chain architecture proposal for a new African logistics company, complete with the technical specifications of a proprietary routing algorithm, a financial modeling section that accounted for variables no Western consulting firm would know to include, a risk assessment that read like it had been written by someone who personally experienced every failure mode they were describing. It was 74 pages. He read every word, twice. He spent the next 3 months trying to find the author. The document was immaculate. No metadata, no identifying information, no traceable origin. He hired 2 separate cybersecurity firms. He engaged his private intelligence contacts. He found nothing. The author was careful with the specificity that suggested they were not just private by preference, but private by necessity, like a person who wanted the idea to be evaluated without the evaluation being colored by who they were. Eventually, through channels he has never fully disclosed, he found Kwame Asante, a man who claimed to be building the exact company the document described, who showed him progress, real infrastructure, real early contracts that aligned with the plan, who, when pressed for the technical specifications of the routing system, produced documentation that was clearly derivative of the original proposal, simplified, slightly misunderstood, but recognizably descended from the same source. Idris asked Kwame directly whether he had written the original proposal. Kwame said yes. Idris did not believe him, but he could not prove otherwise. And the company was real, and the system was working, and the opportunity was too significant to walk away from on an unsubstantiated instinct. He invested. He became the silent partner. He watched from a careful distance as Kwame Asante Logistics grew into the continental force that the proposal had predicted. But he never stopped wondering. He had a copy of that original document in a private server. He had spent 5 years building in his mind a portrait of the kind of person who could write it. The precision, the elegance, the specific combination of deep technical expertise and structural systems thinking that the document embodied. It was not the work of a front-facing entrepreneur. It was the work of someone who had spent years thinking about a problem nobody else had thought to frame correctly. And when Kwame Asante upended a bucket of ice water over his wife in front of 500 people, and that woman stood there without flinching, without breaking, without collapsing, when her eyes opened and Idris saw in them not grief but calculation, something clicked into place. He had spent 5 years looking for the architect. He was looking at her. He descended the stairs. He put his jacket on her shoulders, and then he took the microphone.
5 years ago, Idris Mensa said, and his voice through the sound system filled every corner of that room with the kind of authority that comes not from volume, but from absolute, unshakable certainty. I received a document that changed my understanding of what was possible on this continent. The room was so quiet you could hear the ice still melting on the marble floor. That document described a logistics architecture unlike anything I had seen in 40 years of working in African infrastructure. It was technical, precise, visionary, and grounded in a level of practical knowledge about the specific realities of our roads, our ports, our customs systems, our informal economies that could only have come from someone who had lived those realities, who had thought about nothing else for years, who had built the solution from the inside out rather than importing a model from the outside in. He paused. He looked at Kwame, not with anger, with something worse, with the calm, clinical attention of a man assembling final evidence. I have spent 5 years trying to find the author of that document. I was told by the man standing here tonight, and his eyes moved to Kwame and did not move away, that he wrote it, that it was his vision, his intellectual architecture, his genius. Another pause. He was not the author. In the absolute silence, somewhere near the back of the room, a woman began to cry very quietly. Only the true creator of that system knows something that no documentation can capture and no presentation can fake: the master code, the specific decision tree logic in the original algorithm that was deliberately omitted from all published versions of the technical documentation. I have asked, in private, over the course of 5 years, every senior technical person at Asante Logistics Solutions for that logic. Not one of them could produce it. Not one of them understood why it was missing. Not one of them even knew to look for it. He turned. He looked at Zola. "Madam, I have one question for you. It will take 10 seconds to answer, and the answer will tell me everything I need to know." Zola's chin lifted. Her voice was quiet, but in that room, in that silence, it carried to every corner. She answered the question, not in 10 seconds, in 7, because she had written the logic. She had made the decision. She remembered every character of the code the way a composer remembers the first melody they ever wrote, not because she had memorized it, but because it was hers. It came from her. It had nowhere else to come from. When she finished speaking, Idris Mensa closed his eyes for exactly 2 seconds. He opened them. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, and now there was something different in his voice, something that could only be described as grief that is transformed into resolve. "The company you have been celebrating tonight was built on a foundation that this woman laid. The algorithm that made Asante Logistics Solutions the most innovative logistics company on this continent was designed, coded, and refined by this woman. The vision that I funded was her vision." He removed his hand from the microphone stand. "I am withdrawing my investment from Asante Logistics Solutions with immediate effect." The sound that went through that room was not a gasp. It was more like the sound of a building settling, a structural groan.
the sound of 500 people recalculating simultaneously. And I am making an offer to the actual architect of this company here and now in this room in front of every witness. He turned back to Zola. I would like to fund whatever you build next, on your terms, in your name, with no intermediary between your genius and its recognition. Here is what Kwame Asante did not do in the 90 seconds following Idris Mensah's announcement. He did not protest, he did not deny, he did not step forward and say, with the voice of a man unjustly accused, "That is not true." He stood completely still. His silence was the confession that his words would never have been. Because whatever Kwame Asante was, and he was many things, some of them genuinely capable, some of them genuinely cruel, all of them genuinely complex in the way that people who build real things from mixed motivations always are, he was not stupid. He knew standing in that room that Zola had answered a question she could not have answered unless she was who Idris said she was. He knew that the master code had never been written down anywhere that Kwame could access, because Zola had always held it back, not as leverage, not as protection, but the one part of the system that lived only in her, the one part that was inarguably, undeniably hers. He had built an empire on the assumption that he could separate the inventor from the invention, that he could take the system and leave behind the woman who wrote it, that he could rewrite the story of the company's origin in enough rooms with enough confidence for long enough that the original truth would eventually disappear. He had not accounted for the fact that some truths have master codes. His mother, seated 3 feet away, was looking at her hands with the specific expression of a woman who has spent years constructing a narrative and now is watching it collapse under cross-examination. She did not clap now, she did not make a sound. She had lived long enough to know when a hand has been played and lost. Tiffany Osei, who had never cared about any of this except as entertainment in proximity to wealth, was quietly assessing the room's energy the way a person of pure social instinct does, calculating the fastest line between herself and the new center of gravity. Within a week, she would be photographed at an event that Zola was attending, positioned carefully in the background, angled toward her rather than away. And Kwame would spend the next year learning what it meant when the man who funded your empire pulls his funding. He would learn it in legal filings and in the slow erosion of contracts. He would learn it in the specific loneliness of being in rooms where the energy has shifted and no one tells you it has shifted. You simply feel it, the way a building knows before the occupants do that something structural has changed. He would also, though no one in that room could have predicted it, eventually find something resembling accountability. Not immediately, not without a great deal of pain, but eventually. The human capacity for self-reckoning is underestimated by almost everyone, including the people who most need to exercise it. But that is a different story, for a different evening. Tonight in this room, the only thing that mattered was the woman in the gold gown with someone else's jacket on her shoulders, who had walked in from the cold of a destroyed marriage and was, without quite realizing it, walking out into the beginning of everything she actually deserved.
She did not stay. There was no version of the evening where Zola Asante remained in that room for the applause, the cameras, the cascade of people suddenly eager to introduce themselves to the woman they had been carefully ignoring for the past 2 hours. She had not come to that ballroom for recognition, and she was not going to perform gratitude for an audience that had watched her be humiliated 30 minutes ago and done nothing. She found the man who had been guarding the private exits and asked, quietly, if she could leave through the back. He looked at her, the ruined gown, the jacket that was not hers, the complete absence of self-pity on her face, and he nodded without asking questions. She paused in the corridor outside the ballroom. The noise of the room bled through the doors behind her. She could hear voices, the restart of conversation, the low roar of 500 people simultaneously attempting to make sense of what they had just witnessed. She would be the topic of every conversation in that room for the rest of the evening, and she would not be present for a single one of them. She took out her phone. She called her son's nanny and confirmed he was asleep. She called her lawyer and said 4 words: "Move everything forward, tonight." Then, She stood in the corridor of the Transcorp Hilton Abuja in Air, in a ruined gown and a stranger's tuxedo jacket, alone, and she allowed herself 30 seconds of something she had not allowed herself in months. The specific grief of a person who has lost something they once loved. Not the empire, not the money, not the status, but the 24-year-old girl who had fallen completely in love with a man who had, for a brief and genuine window, seemed to see her clearly. She grieved her. Quickly, precisely, without ceremony. Then she walked out of the building into the warm Abuja night, raised her arm for a taxi, and let the grief close behind her like water over a stone. She had work to do. Idris Mensa called her 3 days later. She had been expecting the call. She had also been fully prepared to decline if the call was anything other than what it turned out to be. It was a business call, completely professional. He opened by saying that he had no intention of pursuing anything personal before the dust of the preceding week had settled, that he understood completely if she never wanted to see him again, and that if she was open to it, he would like 30 minutes to present a proposal. She gave him an hour. He was, she discovered, the kind of person she had rarely encountered in the world of business. Someone who listened more than he spoke, and who asked questions that revealed he had already done his research. He knew her academic history. He had found her thesis, the one her professor had submitted to journals years ago, and he had read it. He had also, with the help of his technical team, reverse-engineered enough of the Nexus architecture from the Asante logistics systems to understand the scope of what she had built. I want to fund the next version, not Nexus, what comes after Nexus, whatever you think needs to exist next. She looked at him across the table for a long moment. She had a condition, she said. Name it. The company is mine, not 50% mine, not majority mine. Mine. You are an investor. You have seats on the board proportional to your investment. You have full financial transparency and a clear exit mechanism. But the intellectual property, the technical direction, the architectural decisions, those are non-negotiable. I will not build something I do not control. He smiled. Not the smile of a man who has been bested in a negotiation, but the smile of a man who had hoped for exactly this answer and received it. That is the only structure I was prepared to accept, he said. They shook hands. The company she built was called Meridian, named for the imaginary line that divides east from west, north from south. Named for the thing that is a construct, a human-made concept, but that orients everything around it. Named for the thing that is invisible and indispensable simultaneously. She built it the way she had built Nexus, from the problem outward. Not from a desire to replicate what had worked before, but from a fresh, honest assessment of what the next generation of African logistics infrastructure actually needed. She took 18 months before they deployed a single line of production code. She spent those 18 months on the ground, in ports, in warehouses, in offices of ministry officials, in informal markets where transactions happened through WhatsApp and trust networks rather than formal contracts. She listened, she documented, she understood, and then she built. Meridian launched publicly in the 3rd year. Within 18 months of launch, it had replaced Nexus in 4 of the 5 government ministry contracts that Nexus had held. The 5th signed on 6 months later, after Nexus experienced the exact cascade failure that Zola had predicted in the ballroom. The single-point vulnerability she had tried to warn Kwame about hit its trigger condition on a Tuesday morning in the rainy season. 342 active shipments locked simultaneously. The financial exposure exceeded $30 million. The reputational damage exceeded quantification. Asante Logistics Solutions filed for creditor protection 8 months later. This story is not a love story, or rather, it is not only a love story. What happened between Zola Asante and Idris Mensa over the year and a half following that ballroom did not unfold the way these things unfold in films.
There was no dramatic declaration in a rain-soaked airport. There was no perfectly timed confession on a balcony. There was something better and more true. A slow, almost reluctant recognition between two people who were both, for complex and different reasons, not in the habit of trusting quickly. Idris was married once. His wife had died of cancer 11 years earlier. He had not been in a serious relationship since. Not because he was still grieving. He had done his grieving, thoroughly and privately, in the years immediately following. But because the specific kind of life he lived at the intersection of finance and continental power and constant travel was not a life that easily accommodated genuine intimacy. And because, this is important and he would say it himself if you asked, he had not met someone who could look at the world the way he looked at it and see something different rather than the same thing reflected back. Zola's divorce was finalized 14 months after the gala. It was as complex and painful as divorces from that kind of marriage always are. There were asset disputes and legal delays and moments when Kwame's team tried strategies that required Zola's legal team to work extraordinary hours to counter. But Zola had been preparing for it longer than anyone knew. Her lawyer had documentation that predated the gala by almost 8 months. The intellectual property question, who owned what, and how the nexus architecture was to be treated in the divorce settlement, was the most contested element and the most ultimately decisive. She won it. Not all of it. The courts found that the company itself had been a joint venture and that Kwame had operational contributions that carried monetary value. But the core intellectual property, the originating architecture, the documented creation history, that was hers. The master code had always been hers. And now, legally, formally, in black ink on filed documents, that fact existed in the world. She and Idris became friends first, genuinely. The kind of friendship that is only possible between people who have no reason to perform for each other because they have already seen each other in extraordinary circumstances and survived. He had seen her soaked and humiliated and unbroken. She had seen him do something genuinely good in a room of people who were doing nothing. They had the specific trust that comes from having witnessed each other's actual character under pressure. The friendship deepened slowly, over dinner, over arguments about infrastructure policy and continental investment strategy, and the specific failures of post-colonial economic models, over the discovery that they disagreed almost about everything except the things that mattered most. By the time Meridian launched, they were something more than friends. Neither of them used a word for it right away. They were both too old and too careful for that. But people who saw them together understood what they were looking at.
I want to pause here, before we close, and speak plainly, because this story is extraordinary, but the thing underneath it is not unusual. The thing underneath it happens every day, in every industry, in every country on this continent, and every continent on this earth. Brilliant women build things, and then, through a combination of systems designed to credit the wrong people, partners who are not strong enough to share the spotlight, environments that are not yet built to recognize female authorship, and a culture that is still more comfortable with a man in the hero role, those women watch someone else take credit for what they created. This happens in technology, in science, in medicine, in art, in agriculture, in every domain of human ingenuity. There are women whose names are not on the things they built, whose contributions are buried under the names of the men they trusted enough to build alongside. Zola's story ended differently from most, not because she was luckier, but because a specific sequence of extraordinary events forced the truth into a room where it could not be ignored. Most of the women in her position do not get that room. Most of them fight quieter battles, in courtrooms that have no cameras, and in professional communities that do not respond with standing ovations. Most of them win slowly or not at all. But the structure of what happened to Zola, the pattern, the shape of it, is something we can learn from.
because the system she built had something that could not be replicated, transferred, or stolen: the master code. The one element that lived only in her, that had no existence outside of her mind, that could only be verified by the person who had created it. She had kept that, not strategically, not because she anticipated needing it, but because she had always known, somewhere beneath the surface of every decision she made, that what she built was hers, and she had never quite let go of the core of it. That is the thing worth carrying out of this story, the master code. Know what yours is, the specific expertise, the specific insight, the specific originality of your contribution that cannot be summarized in a presentation or extracted into a document or transferred through osmosis to someone who didn't earn it. Know it, hold it, not as a weapon, not as leverage, but as the simple, factual, inarguable evidence of who you are and what you made. Kwame Asante thought he could take the system and leave behind the woman who built it. He was wrong in a way that eventually cost him everything, because the system, magnificent as it was not the source. The woman was the source, and sources cannot be replaced with their outputs. Meridian is, at the time of this story being told, the leading logistics technology company in West Africa and one of the 10 most significant on the continent. It operates in 9 countries. It employs over 300 people, 70% of whom are women. It has a graduate fellowship program that funds 12 engineers per year from low-income backgrounds, because Zola has not forgotten the girl from Kumasi with the scholarship and the 4 monitors. She is 38 years old. She sits at the head of a boardroom in a building she designed in Accra's cantonments district, in offices where the whiteboards are always covered and the servers never sleep and the work is never finished, because the problem is never finished, and that, she will tell you, is the point. Idris Mensa is 54. He is, by most accounts, a more present person than he was before a certain gala evening in Abuja. He attends Meridian's board meetings in person, which people who have known him for decades note is unusual. He is also occasionally observed in the corridors of those meetings arguing heatedly with the CEO about infrastructure policy. He is also occasionally observed in restaurants in Accra and Nairobi and Lagos, listening to the same person with the specific attention of a man who is sure he is exactly where he should be. Their son, Kwame Asante, is 9 years old. He lives with his mother. He visits his father on alternating school holidays. He has his mother's precision and his father's confidence, and he is, by every account, astonishing. Kwame Asante runs a small transport consultancy in Tema. He is, by those who have crossed his path recently, a quieter man than he was. Whether that is wisdom or simply the specific gravity of consequence is not something this story is in a position to adjudicate. Mrs. Adwa Asante tends her garden in Kumasi. She and Zola do not speak. They will likely never speak. Some things do not require reconciliation. They simply require distance and the passage of time, and the eventual acknowledgement in private of facts that neither party has yet found the words for. And somewhere in the archives of the Transcorp Hilton Abuja's security system, somewhere in a file that no one will ever publicly review, is footage of the exact moment a man decided to publicly execute his wife's dignity, instead detonated the last viable remnant of his own. He heard the ice hit the marble. He did not hear the empire collapsing. But the sound was there. It is always there. Beneath every act of cruelty that mistakes itself for power, beneath every moment of public humiliation performed by someone who believes they can control what other people feel and know and remember, beneath all of it, the sound of consequence is already playing. We just have to be quiet enough to hear it. Some storms are not designed to destroy you. Some storms are specifically, precisely, divinely designed to wash away every single person and circumstance that was never actually meant for you, so that what remains when the air clears is only what is real, only what was always yours, only the architecture that no one else could have built because it came from inside a mind that is singular and irreplaceable. Zola Asante was not saved by Idris Mensa standing up in a ballroom. She saved herself by building something that could not be erased, by knowing the master code, by standing in the ice without breaking, not because she had no feeling, but because she had far too much to do to fall apart in a room that hadn't earned her tears. Real power is not found in the ability to make someone smaller. Real power is found in the ability to recognize brilliance, even when it is standing soaked and alone on a cold marble floor. Real power is the refusal to let the story be told by the people who need it to be told wrong. In every great scandal of ambition and betrayal, the counterfeit king always loses the crown to the woman who built the kingdom. The question is only ever whether she gets the credit while she is still alive to receive it. If this story resonated with you, hit the like button and subscribe to this channel. We release a brand new cinematic story every single day. Real stories, reimagined, true patterns, humanized, power, ambition, love, and consequence, told in the way they deserve to be told. See you in the next one.